Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is.
Hi, my name's Max Whitby. I live on a small island in the North Sea called the Holy Island of Lindisfarne. And I've had a long career in interactive media. I started at the BBC, um, made science films of a conventional kind, and then became part of the BBC's early interactive experiments, very pioneering group. We did a management buyout, and then I've gone on to run quite a few independent media companies working in the digital space, making apps and other things.
Now, Lindisfarne, wasn't that the name of a sort of folk inflected pop band of the 70s?
Yes, very well remembered. I think they probably stole the name from the island itself, but the island's been here for much longer than the band. And it's a seat of Christianity in Britain, and had a monastery here quite early, and is very famous for the Lindisfarne Gospels, the most beautiful illuminated Gospels painted on vellum by the monks of Holy Island, and now in the British Museum.
And
Sorry, British Library, I think British Library.
is your island, if I can call it that, seeing any of the signs of climate change that so many islands are?
Well, yes, the distinctive thing about Holy Island is that you have to have a kind of 24-hour intuitive understanding of tides, because you can only drive onto the island at low tide and get off. So it's very complicated when I need to book a train, because you have to have your tide timetable in one hand, and then you have to have the train timetable up on the screen in the other, and you have to work out what's going to happen if the train's late, because then you might miss the tide, etc., etc. So the tides are gradually getting higher. There's an amazing interactive map. I don't remember the URL um, off by heart, but you'd find it very easily by Googling interactive sea level rise map. And you can basically type into this map any location in the world. You can put in a date in the future, and you can put in one or two assumptions about how sea level might rise. You know,
Hmm.
how many degrees temperature of warming, for example, or how much CO2 reduction we managed to achieve. And then you can see how the landscape around you will flood. And my house happens to be on one of the very last bits of Holy Island that will go underwater. But since I'm at an altitude of a dizzy 10 meters above average sea level, I fear my great grandchildren are not going to inherit much.
This is an issue. I used to live in New Orleans, which of course is actually below sea level. And my friends who are homeowners there, one of whom is a climate scientist, know that there will be nothing to leave grandchildren, literally. I mean, they know as a certainty.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to the BBC, if I could. There was a moment that I can remember in the late 70s, early 80s, when the BBC was in the, as I recall anyway, in the vanguard of computer technology, just as Britain had been in the 40s. And so new technology was it in some sense. Have I got that right or correct?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And you're probably thinking of the BBC Micro, which was one of those early projects, which was a collaboration between the BBC and Acorn, I think, an early computer company. And it led to the production of relatively affordable, great personal computers. Actually, I think before the Apple II. So it was really very early days. And the critical thing was that the BBC ran a whole series of programs, very nicely produced programs, to explain to the world at large what programming was and how you could learn basic and
Mhm.
run things on a computer. So it had a really important role to play in the evolution of personal computers into people's homes and lives. The bit of the BBC that I joined was run by an extraordinary man, still around, called Peter Armstrong, and he founded the Interactive Television Unit. This is in the in the BBC before the age of the internet. So we're talking late 80s, early 1990s. And Peter had a brilliant way of running a project in the BBC kind of under the radar, trying to make sure that more senior people in the BBC didn't know about it by hiding the budget in various ways. And he collaborated this time with Philips, the the great Dutch consumer electronics company, who at the time were in their sort of heyday, and they had invented the laser disc, and this was a precursor to the CD-ROM. Really, it was kind of taking over from interactive from videotape, but it had the incredible feature that you could jump in a program from one frame to another virtually instantly. So it opened up the possibility of making interactive television. And that was just incredibly exciting for those of us who saw that this would be a thing one day. And I was recruited by Peter because I was one of the very few people in the BBC with a computer from, uh, at the time, a little known, obscure Californian computer company called Apple. And so I joined this group to actually lead a collaboration between the BBC and Apple for a couple of years with their multimedia group in San Francisco. And we had an incredibly heady, exciting time trying to invent ways in which interactive media could be deployed. And it was really before much of the grammar had been, designed. It's very exciting.
So, how did the BBC fall away from this? I mean, we can all remember its disastrous attempts, I guess a decade or so later, to go digital with ITV, and the God knows how many millions, hundreds of millions of pounds were wasted. How did it go from being an innovator to
Yeah,
being
well,
pathetic?
unfortunately, Peter Armstrong's attempts to keep the unit secret failed shortly after I joined, and the BBC was aghast at how much money was being spent on something that would clearly have no impact on license payers, BBC license payers for decades. So they immediately closed us down, and we didn't want to be closed down. So I was one of three principals in the group, and we managed to raise funding from a foundation in New York, the Markle Foundation, God bless them. And they put, I think, $1 million into a spin out. So we did a management buyout, and a group of about 20 of us, bought the IP and the people, and we went and set up offices in Primrose Hill, a lovely part of London.
Indeed.
And we had a fantastic, exciting company there. And it was very well timed, actually, because Apple supported us, did a number of projects together with Apple. And it was just at the time the CD-ROM was becoming a real medium. And so just pre-internet, there was actually a boom in interactive media based on the CD-ROM. And you could create programs on CD-ROM that you could sell, and people would put them in their computers and they'd play games and they'd have reference works, and we did well enough that actually we ended up having a flotation, an IPO on one of the small new stock exchanges in London called AIM, and that was incredibly exciting. And we went through a trajectory that was quite typical for the dot-com boom of boom and bust. But for about 7 years, we had a very interesting business. Learned a lot of lessons actually, and maybe we'll go on to talk about another company, maybe 15 years later, after that business was called the Multimedia Corporation, MMC. Amazingly, the BBC still had a 20% stake in us, which was unusual for a management buyout. And the BBC, I think, made some of its money back when we had the IPO.
Now, at some point in all of this, you stagger off to a chemistry laboratory or two.
Well, with my ill-gotten gains from our stock market flotation, I scratched an itch which had been itching since the early part of my career when I made lots of science films. I was in the BBC Science department. I directed a show called Tomorrow's World, which, if you're of a certain age, you might remember, a live science show, very enjoyable. And I also made many Horizon documentaries, known as Nova in the US. And my first degree was in philosophy. And I'd always felt I was like a someone in a beautiful garden, staring into a greenhouse full of wonderful plants, but never able to go into the greenhouse. And the greenhouse, of course, is science. So I decided to do a PhD, actually in chemistry. The reason being, um, I developed a great interest at that time in the periodic table of elements. And I thought in order to pursue this interest, I should actually be a proper scientist with proper qualifications. So in my late 40s, I think it was, I went back to college and studied with fellow students half my age. I had to do exams, and because I couldn't do a PhD straight away, I had to do a master's for a year and a bit since I didn't have any real formal science training before that. But I had a fantastic supervisor and had a really great time at Imperial College in London, and I did end up with a PhD in chemistry, yeah, which I then applied to this mad interest in the periodic table.
Yes, and that really does. I know we're jumping around a bit here, and you can sort me out when I get the chronology wrong or things are completely left missing that should be included. But the periodic table becomes a theme in your work really ever since, doesn't it?
Yeah, and still to this day, if I look across the room, I can see a wooden box with 118 little bottles in it. And in each of the bottles is a pure element. And there are, in fact, 92 natural elements in the world, in the universe, in the entire universe, as far as we know, from which everything, including ourselves, is made. That leaves, if my maths is right, 26 bottles that are completely empty because they contain artificial elements that are made by scientists in great accelerators, and essentially they only exist very fleetingly. They have very short half-lives. If ever you saw a lump of most of them, it would be the last thing you ever saw because they would detonate like an atomic bomb and the village or town or city you were in would vaporize. So I don't put any of those in the bottles, but the other 92 have a lump of stuff, and some of them are gold and oxygen and carbon. But in fact, there's some others that are quite dangerous, certainly very interesting. Um, each has its own kind of character and soul. And the aim in building a periodic table collection is to try and capture the essence of each element in a very beautiful form. I completely reject the idea of having dull powders. I always want a solid piece, preferably a crystalline piece, showing the colors and character of the element.
And take us on some of the trajectory, the chronology, the experience of sharing the periodic table with others in different iterations. Because for me, as a child studying science, it was just a box with a letter and a number, really.
Yeah, well, I think the most important thing to appreciate about the periodic table is that it's essentially a window on our civilization. And if you look at any element, it has a whole variety of uses and cultural significance in our civilization. And it has many stories around it. So it's a fabulous frame in which to tell stories and explain the world. And chemistry, I think, is an interesting science because it really is about understanding how the world works. Um, and if you get into the story of the elements, it's a fantastic way of organizing and structuring that. And in fact, my interest in the periodic table and my career in interactive media collided spectacularly around about 2006 as a result of trying to buy bits of a nuclear missile on eBay.
As you do.
Yeah, well, in order to build a periodic table, you have to have a bit of every element. And some elements, like beryllium, are very hard to find. And one of its uses is in the rocket engines of nuclear missiles. And occasionally, certainly back in those days, bits of these nuclear missiles would turn up in second-hand scientific equipment auctions and would eventually find their way onto eBay. And so I would bid on these, and uh, to my great annoyance, the very best samples, which in those days you could buy on eBay, were often snapped up in the last few seconds of an auction by this mysterious American bidder called Theodore Gray. And eventually this happened enough that I got so annoyed I thought I should actually get in touch with him. And I discovered that A, rather like me, he was someone interested in collecting the elements from the periodic table. B, had run a collaboration with Apple. Um, and C, was very interested in digital media and software engineering. And in fact, he was a co-founder of a remarkable American software company called Wolfram Research. He and Stephen Wolfram created an amazing piece of software called Mathematica, which to this day is essentially the Microsoft Word for mathematicians. You know, it's the word processor for if you do mathematics.
Right.
And Teo and I formed a partnership, to cut a long story short, and decided to um, start a business making periodic tables. And we ended up over the last 20 years making probably 300 or 400 periodic tables. Some small, could fit on your kitchen table. Others, I think the biggest one we did was 18 meters tall. We ended up selling one to Bill Gates. He has it in his private library in his house, and to many universities and schools and interesting people around the world. And these periodic tables are the sort of the canonical ones are um, about sort of as high as a person, a couple of meters high, 3 or 4 meters wide, and they have 118 compartments. And in each compartment, we put a beautiful sample of the element, but then also a dozen or so objects that show how that element is used in the world. So for radium, for example,
Mhm.
we have a 1930s bedside alarm clock painted
Yes,
alarmingly
quite.
in
Yeah,
radioactive
yeah.
luminous paint with radium in it. And so any one of these periodic tables will have maybe 500 interesting objects in it from the whole of the history of science and technology. Um, and that is what meant we were in an interesting position when Steve Jobs, who Teo had worked with um, during his collaboration with Apple and who I'd come across once or twice, um, uh, uh, gave us a hint that Apple was about to release something that could be interesting called the iPad. And we were in the very, very fortunate position of knowing for a couple of months before the iPad came out that it was coming. And that there would be things called apps that you could put on it, and an app store where apps could be sold. And so we
Hey
had a
ho,
flat
you
operation.
guys made one.
We made an app about the periodic table. It was called The Elements, and it was an absolute kind of textbook example of being in the right place at the right time because
Hmm. Hmm.
it was a very beautiful app. I brought in friends from my time as a producer of interactive media who are brilliant designers and engineers. And in a very short space of time, in an intense burst of activity, we produced an app called The Elements, which ended up being exactly what Apple needed to explain what the iPad was and why it wasn't a Kindle. And at the time the iPad came out, the Kindle existed, but the iPad could do 10 things that the Kindle couldn't even begin to do. One of which was to take a super high resolution photorealistic image of the 500 objects in our periodic table of elements and you could put your finger on the iPad screen and move left and right, and this object would spin, rotate in front of you as if you were touching it and as if you were looking at it like a 3D jewel on the screen. And it's hard to remember now when we take such things for granted. Um, just an asterisk that I should come back to at that point. Um, but there's an article, just a blog that's just been published, a blog post, a beautiful analysis of how we take things for granted. I think it's called Her Coat of Many Colors, and it's about that loss of a appreciation of what's magic. But anyway, the iPad um, um, was launched famously. Our app was on it. It was on the iPads that went to all the journalists so they could see what the iPad could do. It was in the iPads that went into every Apple store. It was on billboards. I remember driving across America and seeing our app on enormous billboards. An amazing experience. And of course, it was a transformative thing for us because we were selling thousands of these things a day at a decent price. I think we were selling it for $10 or $15. And it sold for years and years and still does actually. It was an extraordinary thing. And on it, Teo and I were able to build a company to make interactive media of a kind that was undreamt of in the days of CD-ROM.
Mm.
Um, and we decided to make a whole bunch of apps. We formed a company called Touch Press. Um, and over about 5 or 6 years, we made probably 20 or 30 uh, really beautiful apps covering both science and the arts. We made apps about music, we made apps about poetry, we made apps about the solar system and uh, science. Yeah, it was exciting.
And all sorts of implications here for pedagogy, whether you're talking primary school, secondary school, or university. Yeah.
Very much so, yes. I mean, a good example is the app we did on my favorite poem, which is T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. And of course, you have the full poem of the full text of the poem on the iPad screen. Very, very well typeset, with careful consideration of typography. And you can put your finger on the screen and scroll down and it scrolls. But then if you stroke any line of the poem,
Hmm.
you can have the world's experts in English literature discuss that particular bit of the poem in context right next to you. Or you can hear that verse read aloud by T.S. Eliot himself, both as a young man and as an old man, by Sir Alec Guinness, by half a dozen actors and um, professors of literature, and it's a wonderful thing. And another trick is touching one of the controls, and the page dissolves, and up comes T.S. Eliot's original typescript manuscript with all his annotations in it for that exact part of the poem. And so, as a way of learning about that poem, I think it's hard to beat. We got reviewed in the New York Times, which for an app was a good thing, and they liked it a lot. It was, I should immediately say, a partnership, as were almost all our apps, a partnership with Faber, the publishers for whom T.S. Eliot was a director, and they have a very long association with the Eliot estate. And we did other collaborations with organizations that are really experts in their field. For example, Deutsche Grammophon, the German music publishers. We did an app on Beethoven's Ninth Symphony with 5 different recordings of the symphony, where as you listen to the symphony, you see the score scrolling in perfect sync with each note being highlighted. And then if you want, you can switch between the 5 different versions, the 5 different recordings by 5 different conductors over a 60-year period. from a really recent contemporary one going back to some of the great recordings in the Deutsche Grammophon. And so if you're, a serious musicologist, there's an awful lot you can get out of that. And of course, we had interviews with people that are synchronized to the playing music. It's a very, very rich and exciting medium. And it went through a period of about 5 years when you could publish these things and people would buy them and appreciate them. And then what happened is that digital phenomenon, um, enshittification, where things just get worse and more bad apps came out for free. It was very, very difficult to maintain a sense of quality and to keep an audience going. The best example of that, I think, was the last really big, ambitious app we made, which is a history of animation. And for that, we partnered with Disney, who, are arguably a fantastic partner for that particular subject. And we and Disney poured our heart and soul and an awful lot of money into making that app. I think the budget was certainly getting on for $1 million. It came out and almost immediately was nominated App of the Year in 2013. It was an unbelievably rich, deep, exciting app. Just one of the things you could do is touch any of the characters who, it's sort of like a book that you read through, but with lots of illustrations embedded in the text. And so you can, the way you can get text to flow around a character when you typeset it. So it isn't just a block of paragraph and then a space with an illustration and then another block of text. The text actually flows around.
Mm.
Well, here, if you touch the character and move it around the page, every single individual character on the page animates. It's like kind of stirring a pot of sand, and all the words animate on the page and swirl and twirl until you stop moving the character, and then the text gradually repositions itself to be readable, flowing around the new position of the character. So it's a kind of whimsical touch, but it kind of makes a deep point. And just one other example, and then I'll shut up. But I'm so fond of that app. Um, you can there's a thing called the color map, which has every frame of every Disney film from black and white Mickey Mouse in the 30s all the way up to um, Frozen, which was, the most recent Disney film when we published. And the predominant color of that frame is represented by a pixel. And the entire iPad screen is therefore a kind of spectrum of the history of Disney animated film. And as you move your finger over it, the actual frame appears beside it. So you can kind of scroll both in time up and down and left and right chronologically through the film to explore the whole of Disney's 100 films. And that's a good example of Teo's absolute brilliance and something that you could only do in this medium. However, at the point this came out, it had Disney's huge marketing machine behind it. It was Apple's App of the Year. There was the biggest convention of Disney fans ever gathered. And at the end of about 4 months, we'd sold, getting on for 100,000 copies of this app, and it only just made back the budget. And at that point, I knew that this brief flowering of interactive media was coming to an end, because if you couldn't make a lot of money with an app like that, then there was little hope for a company trying to really have a high quality threshold.
And this is a classic case of what Lenin, not Lennon, called capitalist overproduction, where, you called it enshittification, as of others. Suddenly, great opportunities are created by brilliant minds, academic, entrepreneurial, engineering, cultural. And then along come Johnny and Jackie come latelys with rubbish, but they produce so much rubbish that in a sense contaminates the entire effort. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the market is the market, and in many ways, the fact that now digital technology has essentially allowed anyone to become a publisher or a broadcaster, made the tools of production essentially free, is a wonderful thing. If I go back to my own early career making films for the BBC at that time, um, it was virtually impossible for anyone without having gone to film school
Yes.
to make television programs. Now, everyone can make television programs just using their phone, and almost everyone can afford a phone to do that. So, it's enormously exciting.
Yeah.
If you
And
look at
there
what
is that
YouTube has become.
democratization, which is tremendously important, as you say.
Mm.
The problem is that the democratization leads to a new kind of commodification without there necessarily being very high standards. And that's what troubles me when, for instance, my younger daughter, when I'm with her, sometimes watches home movies essentially on YouTube that are actually excuses for product placement of cars and sandwiches and clothes and whatnot, you know? And uh, although I like watching television with her and all sorts of things with her, I don't enjoy this because I like seeing high quality production, you know? So that's the other side to it. But there is the democratization, which, as you say, is wonderful.
Yeah. By the way, we should give credit to Cory Doctorow, who I think came up with the term enshittification in uh, in 2022. I think he was using it to describe the Google experience, which at one time, when you search for something, would actually produce useful results, but has since, exactly as your daughter has discovered, become essentially a tool for advertising.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So this is I mean, part of the history of the opening up of communications technologies from being black boxes to things that are more amenable to understanding and control. Now, you mentioned earlier an asterisk. Have we covered what was in the asterisk, or do we need to go back to that?
Not fully, no. I mean, you can make a very brief pause while I quickly research. The color of her coat is the name of the essay, and if you give me a brief moment, I will see if I can find it.
Absolutely. We'll pause.
So I've managed to locate this essay that my friend John Norton came across and brought my attention to. And the essay is called "The Colors of Her Coat," and it's a absolutely fabulous essay by Scott Alexander on his blog, I think Semantic Apocalypse. It uh, it sounds bizarre and difficult to understand, but it's actually an extremely interesting essay that um, you should go to. So just search for Scott Alexander and Semantic Apocalypse, and the essay is called "The Colors of Her Coat," and it's essentially about the appreciation of beauty in the world and the way that we lose our sense of magic in an age of endless miracles.
Terrific. Well, I've just found it thanks to your steer. I see it only came out 4 weeks ago.
Yeah.
So there it is. And I guess what I'm hearing in amongst all the different directions you've taken, there's a certain consistency, an interest in science, an interest in technology, an interest in nature. And that gets me on to ornithology because you're a birder, Doc W. Tell us about being a birder, a strange word that I only encountered for the first time a few years ago.
Well, yes, I certainly admit to being a birder. I'm also a moth-er and a butterfly-er or lepidopterist, and I love nature of all kinds. But in the case of birds, um, there's been another intersection with digital media because early on in those CD-ROM days I was talking about, I thought that a bird watching guide would be a brilliant thing to do on a CD-ROM because in addition to having the still paintings of birds and the text describing them, you could also have sound. So you'd be able to hear what a bird sounds like, and indeed video. And so um, I went to my colleagues in this multimedia corporation, this spin out from the BBC, and proposed this project to do a CD-ROM guide to British birds. And at the time, bird watching was so deeply unfashionable. They sort of sneered and said no. But I refused to be deterred, and I asked if they'd mind if I went and set up my own company to do it because I thought it was such a good idea. So they said, "Of course you can. What a stupid thing to waste your time on." But I did, and now here I am. What is it? 40 years later, 30 years later, and I still have that company. It's called Nature Guides Limited, and our number one best-selling app is the Collins Bird Guide, which is for anyone in Europe, the fairly leading definitive app that you can use to identify birds. We've just added fashionably artificial intelligence to it so that you can um, have the app listen to birds that are calling and tell you what it thinks they might be, or look at photographs, or look through your binoculars and identify birds. And the two because and of course there are various free versions of that are around, but the two gimmicks or the two good features that we've put in are that the machine learning model runs on the phone locally, so it doesn't need to go out into the cloud to do that. So that can be very good if you're birding somewhere inaccessible. And it's also better for the planet to do that, I suppose. And also because the AI is integrated into the book, into the reference, into the guide. When you find something you think it might be, you're instantly there, and you can see what it should be like and watch videos. And so it's quite a nice experience. So, but anyway, that app, the Bird Guide, is our kind of best-selling foundation of the company at the moment. And it contains, optionally, if you want, videos for all 800 species of birds found in Europe. And I'm ashamed to say I filmed about 90% of them over the last 30 or 40 years in every spare waking moment, traveling to far corners of Europe. In fact, I'm just about to go in 3 weeks' time back to my favorite bit of Europe, which is Arctic Norway, the very, very northern bit. 3 hours flight by jet from Oslo north, way into the Arctic Circle to an amazing part of the world called Varangia Fjord. And it's a bird is complete paradise where at this time of year, all of the birds that have been wintering in southern Europe and Africa arrive to breed in the Arctic tundra where the sun never goes down and it's day for 24 hours and there's insects and food and breeding territory and they're full of hormones and it's like being in Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. Um, just fantastic, and I can't wait to go back.
So much of what you're telling us, I think, involves dramatic successes, but not exactly failures, but downturns as well. Could you talk to us a bit about that? Not necessarily in empirical terms, but it could be, but conceptual terms. What it's like to start companies, have things go wonderfully, and then everything goes split or
Yeah,
something.
well, I mean, I guess I must have started about 10 companies in my career. And of those, two have been for a period pretty successful in the sense that they made a lot of money or they won, lots of awards and had an impact on the world. Um, Out of the remaining eight, probably four have been kind of okay and people earned a living and we got some good things done. And then four exploded and went wrong for various reasons. But I think every single one I've learnt from. Um, and even within the successful companies, we've had projects that have been, absolute abject failures.
Mm.
Um, but but one learns from those, and I think the thing that endures for me more than anything else is the experience of working with good people and being in a a small group of people with a common purpose where you spark ideas off one another and do new things and have an impact on the world. And there's nothing more satisfying or exciting than that, I think.
And that would bring you back to the BBC, but also to bench science, right? Where collaboration matters.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely any endeavor these days is collaborative, and I think actually one of the perhaps less appreciated things to understand about AI. I've been spending a lot of my time doing AI things recently. Um, is that successful use of AI is about collaborating with the giant inscrutable matrices that are behind it. Um, it's not a question of getting AI to do something and you tell it a set of instructions and it goes away and does it. It's much more interactive process where you're sitting down with an extremely powerful and competent intelligence, but you have things that it doesn't, and obviously it has things that you don't, and the two of you together can do things that are just superhuman.
So, do you feel positive about the way artificial intelligence is heading? It's a
I
complex
think I think it's the most exciting, terrifying, important thing that's happened in my lifetime. I think we're only just at the foothills of what's to come. Um, I think there are huge questions about changes in the landscape of employment. There are real threats about malevolent AIs, um, embodied or disembodied, being bad for us. Um, there are scenarios that I think imply a very bleak future for humans in our current form. But there are also extraordinarily exciting possibilities where blended biology and silicon, carbon and silicon become, a very exciting um, evolution of what it is to be alive and conscious. So I mean, I sometimes wake up in the morning and I think, oh, I had this amazing dream that, we've actually managed to build intelligent machines and you can get them to do things. And it still strikes me as a miracle that it's happened and so exciting. And every day I think of something new that I could try to do with it. Let me give you a crazy example. I live on this island, as we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation, which is ruled by the tides. And um, I want to understand when the road actually closes, when the tide comes up. And on the island, the kind of folklore is it's from 2 hours before high tide to 3 hours after. And that's the 5 hours when you can't drive on and off the island. And that happens twice a day. Well, in fact, that's not quite true because if the air pressure is low, then the tides tend to be a bit higher because there isn't the weight of the atmosphere pushing down the sea. And if there's been a strong east wind for a period of time, we'll get bigger tides because the waves get pushed over here. And um, in the monthly cycle of the moon, you get big tides, spring tides, and small tides. And there are some days when the water hardly covers the causeway on the island. Anyway,
Hmm. Hmm.
to to explore this, I realized one morning that I could set up my iPad on my windowsill, looking out of my front drive, where I have a little glimpse of the road leading to the island. And I used AI to count the cars and to build a log so that I've been doing it for a month now. So I have a month of data with something like 50,000 vehicles moving backwards or forwards, time stamped. And if you plot that, you see a beautiful pattern where when the tide is up, no vehicles, when the tide is down, lots of vehicles. I also have a temperature sensor for my solar panels that has recorded to zero point 0.1 of a degree the air temperature and
Hmm.
the air pressure going back over that same period. And I've also got the mathematical formula for calculating the height of the tide on any given day. And so I sat down with Claude 3.7 Sonnet, my favored giant inscrutable matrices. And over a period of 4 or 5 hours, we grappled with this data. Claude went away and wrote programs to plot it and analyze it and do regression analysis. And I think I now can understand the relationship between air pressure, the tide, the moon, and car traffic.
But this is one of these things where the original idea comes from you. The raw material is both nature and also human interaction with nature. The analytic tools are from mathematics and sociology and statistics. And the hard work is being done by your recording devices and your preferred artificial intelligence
Hmm.
system. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's a pretty good summary. I don't think I'm exaggerating to say that the work we were able to do in about 5 hours would 5 years ago have taken a team of people with different expertise, probably months
Yeah.
to do the same thing. And that kind of amplification, if you apply it to more interesting problems, perhaps than the one I was obsessed by, is just going to unleash a wave of understanding in science and I think in culture too, because you can apply it, also to patterns in literature and music, and it's going to be so exciting, so exciting.
Well, Max, I want to thank you for the time you've given us today. But before we end things, I'm wondering if there's anything you'd like to add. This could take the form of your touching on a topic we haven't discussed at all, or it could be in the form of saying, "My God, did I really say that? What I wish, which I'd said was."
Well, I don't think I regret. I think I probably made one or two errors for which I apologize. But I guess I will just mention the project that's taken up most of my time for the last 5 years. And it took up almost all of my time during the 2 years of lockdown. And that was a hubristic endeavor to photograph the entire celestial sphere. And just before lockdown, I had another of these moments when I woke up and I thought, ooh, astronomy, all those nice pictures of galaxies and nebulae and things. I wonder how they're taken. This was about 5 years ago. I know. I'll um I'll go on a course to find out. So I had a Google and as it was in those days, and it was before it was totally enshittified. Thank you, Cory Doctorow. And I found a tutor, an astronomy professor, running a workshop for 4 people at Australia's best observatory at Siding Springs. And this was Christian Sasser, a remarkable man. And I went and spent an amazing week learning how to take photographs of the sky. And the southern sky at that particular amazing location is completely fantastic. So um, I then decided to set up my own telescope, and Chile is the best place in the world to have telescopes. So I set up a telescope in Chile just before lockdown. I set another one up in Spain. And so these telescopes I could control from Holy Island remotely, and they would point where I wanted them to point and take pictures. And to cut a very long story short, over a year and a half, in partnership with Charlie Bracken, a brilliant American astrophotographer, we photographed the entire night sky by making a mosaic. And we took about 10,000 individual photographs. And then um, using Charlie's brilliant skills in computer manipulation of data, we essentially created the entire sphere of the visible universe. And the first thing we've done is publish that as a book called The Visible Universe. But we're hard at work on other projects, one of which is a VR embodiment of it, where you can essentially put your head into that sphere. And a bit like the 800 Birds of Europe, the celestial sphere has about 110 really big, juicy galaxies and nebulae. And our book is an exploration of these wonderful objects that are hiding in plain sight above our head. So that's been my recent obsession.
And a wonderful one to have, along with the birds and all the others. You've made a remarkable contribution. And as I said a minute or two ago, many thanks for sharing some of your story with us.
Well, thank you, Toby, very much indeed. I've enjoyed our conversation.